Hey everybody, this video initially started out as a my thoughts on video covering the Command Conquer Remastered Collection, but I realized that I don't really have all that much to say about the Remastered Collection itself, and so I decided to go ahead and expand the scope of the video to cover remasters in general, just the topic itself. And it is actually a pretty relevant topic, considering that we're seeing more and more games getting remasters as opposed to just getting re-releases, and so it's a topic worth talking about and giving you an idea of where I stand on them, considering we're seeing more and more remasters coming out. Before I go any further though, I do want to talk about some of the differences between remakes, remasters, and re-releases, because they are three very different things. And I'll start from the lowest effort to the highest effort of the bunch. The lowest effort of them is just a simple re-release. These are where companies will take an old game, whether they've just acquired the license of it or whether they've just dug it up from the archives or whatever, then they do the bare minimum required to get it running on modern systems and put it out on storefronts so that people can buy it again. So to give you an example of what I'm talking about, there are a lot of old games available on GOG and Steam that are really nothing more than the original versions of the game, maybe with the DRM removed so that they actually work, and all that's been done to them is that they are put into a pre-configured SCUM VM or DOS box so that they will run on modern systems without any fuss, because the original versions certainly do not run on modern systems. A similar kind of thing is when an older console or arcade game is re-released on usually PC, but also sometimes on consoles as well, and instead of getting the game to run natively on the target hardware like PC or a more modern console, all they're really doing is packaging the original game with an emulator so that it can run on that modern hardware without any problems. This is where I have to distinguish between a re-release and a port. A port actually is a fairly involved process because you are taking the original game and you are trying to get it to run natively on a different system. That actually requires going into the game code and modifying it so that it does run natively on whatever your target system is. That's a very involved process, and that's not what a simple re-release is. A re-release is merely taking the original game, throwing in whatever compatibility fixes are necessary to get it running on a modern system, and then putting it out on storefronts. Then so when I'm talking about re-releases, I am not talking about ports. The next step in complexity from a re-release is a remaster, where you are taking the original game and you are trying to get it running not only natively on modern systems, but you're also trying to make some improvements to it. So we're talking things like upscaling the textures or the cutscenes. We're talking things like redesigning the interface so that it's more comfortable on modern displays, maybe adding in some convenience features that have become more or less standard in whatever the genre it is, but weren't really a thing in that particular game, improving the sound quality, fixing bugs that the original game might have had, things like that. These are more substantial than just re-releasing the game, but they are still just modifications to the existing game code and assets. Of course, this isn't to downplay the effort it takes to make a proper remaster. If they're doing their job properly, then it does take quite a bit of time and effort to properly remaster something without losing what made the original interesting or great. Because sometimes a remaster can be made with the best of intentions and they nail most of it, but they change one or two things and it actually messes with the experience. To give you an example of that, the Homeworld Remastered Collection is a remaster of the original Homeworld along with Homeworld 2, and they decided to bring Homeworld 1 into the Homeworld 2 engine. On paper, that sounds fine. The Homeworld 2 engine is a more advanced engine than what powered the original Homeworld. Except that it does mess a bit with the way ship behavior works. So if you're going from the original to the remaster, it's not exactly the same experience. Is it enough of a change to ruin the experience? Of course not. It's just something that you have to get used to if you're familiar with the original game and you go into the remaster expecting it to be the same, but with better graphics and sound. And you have to be really careful with this kind of thing, because if you go too far with it, then you're going to end up more in remake territory. A remake is going to be the most substantial amount of effort out of all three of these categories, and that's where you keep the absolute fundamentals of what makes that particular game what it is, but everything else you're redesigning from the ground up. To give you a prime example of something more recent, the Final Fantasy VII Remake is a very different game than the original. The original is the traditional JRPG style of your party stands in a line, the other party stands in a line, and you take turns whacking each other repeatedly, only it uses the active time battle system, which is terrible, but that's a topic for a different video. The remake, on the other hand, has a hack-and-slash style JRPG combat system that is radically different from the original, and it makes some pretty substantial changes to the storyline and the content that's in the game, so it is a very different experience than the original Final Fantasy VII. Now, of course, whether or not it's actually any good is a topic for a different video entirely, but you should get the idea there. A remake is a substantial redesign of the game while keeping most of the core elements intact. At least that's the idea. A remaster is taking the original game and just modifying what's already there. So let's take a look at the example that ultimately brought me to making this video in the first place, which is the Command Conquer Remastered Collection. Now, before I talk much further about that, let me go ahead and preface it by saying that I've already reviewed the original Command & Conquer and the original Red Alert. These are both games that I highly respect, but don't really enjoy all that much. I've never really been a Command & Conquer fan. And as far as the original versions of the games go, they're really not all that easy to go back to. It's certainly a lot easier to go back to, say, the original Command & Conquer than it is to go back to Dune 2, but that's not saying much. Dune 2 is barely playable by modern standards. Honestly, even by the standards of its day, it was barely playable, but that's beside the point. Now, the point is really more that the original Command & Conquer is basically as far back as you can go with real-time strategy games and have it still be something resembling playable by modern standards. Command & Conquer Red Alert definitely improved upon this, but it was still a fairly primitive real-time strategy game, all things considered. That's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just a product of when those games were made, and as long as you keep that in mind, you can still go back and mess around with them. Just know that the experience is going to be a bit rough. So what does the Remastered Collection bring to the table? Well, the first thing is going to be one of the most obvious. It runs natively on modern systems, whereas the original games don't without some tweaking. Right off the bat, that's going to be a major benefit. Another major benefit is that it includes all of the expansion packs, both for the original Command & Conquer and for Red Alert. And it also includes additional missions that were previously exclusive to the console versions of the games. That already sets it apart from a lot of other remasters that we see. Most other remasters are really just graphical upscales, maybe remastering the sound quality and improving the controls, and that's kind of it. They may throw in a few fixes and tweaks here and there, depending on what's wrong with the game, if there is anything wrong with it, but they're not normally going to go and find that exclusive content that's part of specific versions and then include that with their remaster. So already the Command & Conquer Remastered Collection is setting itself apart just from that. But then of course there's the other stuff it does. A lot of this is the kind of thing we expect from a remaster, like the graphics that have a modernized option that includes up to 4K visuals. Although it's a 2D RTS, it's not going to be amazing looking no matter what you do. And you can switch between the modernized graphics and the original pixel art with the push of a button. They also remastered the cutscenes, most of which were FMV sequences with live actors, but some of which were CGI as well. And unfortunately, that's a bit more of a mixed bag, because there's only so much you can do with the original footage being as low quality as it is, and the results in the cutscenes for the remaster have this very smudged, blurry quality to them. So sure, they're not heavily pixelated, but they really don't look all that great either. They didn't have any such issues when they remastered the sound, however, which results in very nice, clean sound effects, as well as a remastered soundtrack, which is, of course, excellent, because it's the Command & Conquer and Command & Conquer Red Alert soundtracks with better audio quality, and it also includes an additional 20 tracks that were recorded live by Frank Klepacki and the Tiberian Sons, and those kick all kinds of ass. They even included a jukebox function that allows you to go in and customize what you want in your given playlist, so that when you're going and completing missions and such, it's playing the tracks that you want to listen to. But perhaps the biggest gameplay change is what they did to the interface, which is noticeably better than it was in the original games. It's cleaner, it's easier to work with, and it includes some improvements that weren't in the original games, like the ability to zoom in and out at least a bit so you have a better view of the screen. Thing is, the maps in Command & Conquer 1 and Red Alert were generally fairly small, so you can only zoom out a very small amount, but it's still better than nothing. And then of course the biggest change here being able to queue up units, which you could not do in the original games. You could only train one unit of any type at a time, so if you were building, say, a tank, that was all you could do with your vehicle production structure at that moment. You couldn't queue up additional vehicles. Same with infantry units, you could only train one infantry unit at a time. And that's one of the problems with going back to classic real-time strategy games. A lot of them don't have features that have become commonplace in the genre, like unit queuing or customizable hotkeys or things like that, and the lack of unit queuing in particular can make real-time strategy games just feel positively archaic. You end up not having to worry about that as much when you go into the Command & Conquer Remastered Collection because they have made efforts to make it more comfortable for a modern real-time strategy game player. It's still definitely going back and playing some very old real-time strategy games without any real tweaks to their balance or anything like that, so you're just gonna have to deal with what you're given. But since controls for real-time strategy games have improved so much since the original Command & Conquer especially, but also Red Alert, that could have actually been an issue if they released the remastered version with the original control scheme. Instead, we get a more modern control scheme with the classic gameplay, and that makes it a lot more amenable to a modern audience. Or in the case of people like me, people who have played the original games and are coming back to them after having played other real-time strategy games in the interim. In addition to all of this, they've also overhauled the online play, so it is easy to just jump into a match and do quick play, and you even have leaderboards and ranked matches, so if that's your kind of thing, you can do that. I have no interest in playing real-time strategy games competitively, and I really don't have any interest in playing Command & Conquer online at all, so I didn't mess around with that, but from what I can tell, it seems to work perfectly fine. On top of all of this, they went ahead and also included a bonus gallery that unlocks things as you continue to play through the game, and that gives you things like making of photos and behind the scenes footage, and even some B-roll that just wasn't included in the full game, and even some music that was developed for the game but just never saw release. The end result of all this is that even though the Command & Conquer Remastered Collection does have a few faults, it's really the definitive way to play the original Command & Conquer and Red Alert now. It did exactly what a remaster should. It makes the game playable on modern systems, and it smooths out the rough edges so that people can pick it up and play it without much fuss, while also going out of its way to collect all of the content that was available for the games, including the console-exclusive missions, all into one package. You end up with something that returning fans are going to be very happy with because they can just pick it up and play it and you get that very familiar experience but with the rough edges smoothed out and tons of content to work with, especially considering that the Remastered Collection even includes mod support through the Steam Workshop, which is going a bit above and beyond here, especially for something from a major publisher like Electronic Arts. But even if you're not already a fan of the game, or in this particular case, games, you're getting an experience that captures all of the things that made the original so beloved in the first place, but without a lot of the rough edges that makes going back and playing the original versions a bit of a frustrating mess sometimes. And, doing what a remaster should, it's priced reasonably as well at $20 US. If it were any more than that, I would say that the value proposition's probably not there, but 20 bucks, considering that it's the original Command & Conquer and Red Alert, and all of their expansions, and all of these updates and improvements, it's pretty easy to see that 20 bucks is well worth the investment there if you are either a fan of Command & Conquer or if you're trying to get into it. And of course, it can go on sale for cheap as well. It accomplishes everything that a remaster should. It makes the game playable on modern systems with tweaks and improvements to make it a more comfortable experience without losing any of what made the original so beloved in the first place. But they didn't just do that. They more or less set out to make this the definitive version of Command & Conquer as well as Command & Conquer Red Alert. And they have succeeded at that with flying colors. It is a very well done remaster, and when you look at other remasters in comparison, a lot of them end up falling very short of what the Command & Conquer Remastered Collection does. The thing is, when it comes to producing videos on my channel at least, When a remaster does things properly, there's really not much to talk about there. It's the kind of thing that, at best, I'll talk about in passing in my coverage of the game in question, although in the case of Command Conquer Remastered, I already reviewed both of the games in question here. In fact, I reviewed all of the Command Conquer games thus far. And sure, those videos aren't perfect, none of my videos are for that matter, but what I say in them I think still holds up. I certainly could have worded it better in some cases, and I certainly could have done the video editing better, but I don't feel like going back and redoing those videos in their entirety is really all that worthwhile. Certainly not just to throw in an extra bit about the Command & Conquer Remastered Collection at the end of it. So that's a bit of a dilemma I run into sometimes, where I'll cover a game at some point and then years later it comes out with a remaster of some sort, and that may or may not be worth doing an entire video on. In the case of the Command & Conquer Remastered Collection, I intended to do a full video on it, but then I messed around with it more and more, and there wasn't all that much to talk about in the Remastered Collection, so I decided to go ahead and turn the video into a discussion about just the general topic of remasters, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you all very much for watching. If you like my content, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel, whether it be getting more games for review, or replacing broken equipment, or getting new equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that is perfectly fine. I understand. The option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.